Good morning, Europe. Good evening, Japan. And hello, anywhere. Let me welcome you to this research workshop on EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement, on the Strategic Partnership Agreement, and on the Connectivity Initiative in the context of the SPA. This is the first part of an event which also includes an online symposium next week on Thursday, where we add voices from politics and business. So I already invite you to, if you find it interesting, to have a look at this as well. These events are organized by the Institute of East Asian Studies of the University of Duisburg-Essen, and I would like to acknowledge the support of other institutions, and I'll just mention them in alphabetical order. We are very grateful to the Consulate General of Japan in Düsseldorf, the German-Japanese Business Circle, the German Society of Foreign Policy, the Handelsblatt daily newspaper, and the Japanese Chamber of Commerce in Germany, and last not least, of course, our home institution, the University of Duisburg-Essen. So my name is Werner Pascha. I've been professor for East Asian Economic Studies at this university for a very long time, and I will try to guide you, lead you through these proceedings with our four eminent speakers. The way we're going to do it, let me just explain. I think we thought it would be meaningful to give an introduction to the topics, also in order to let you know how the four contributions will enter this big topic I've just described. So I will do the introduction myself, and then we have the four presentations. We have two groups of two each. There will be 20-minute presentations, and after the first round of two presentations, we're going to have a Q&A section. And after the third and fourth presentation, we will have another question and answer session. So in order to participate during the Q&A, please use the raise hand function in Zoom. Probably most of you are already aware of this, how it works. So if you look at the list of participants and you go to the very bottom of that list of participants on the right-hand side, there will be something like, raise your hand or something related to raise your hand. And we will take note of that and let you ask your question. And in the background, Helmut Demes, who is the manager of our institute, will also be there to help me out to keep the overview. We actually also plan to visualize the proceedings of the workshop and its contents through so-called graphic recording. So we are very excited how that's going to work. And Christoph Ilgens will combine text and graphic and create a stimulating, maybe also a little bit innovative protocol of our event. And if you're interested in that, please check out the website of this workshop and conference in 1 or 2 weeks to see the result. So, to kick off, let me start with this kind of overview and see how this will work out. Okay. Okay. I hope this will work. And so let's start. Maybe it's a good way to start with a number of questions. And here are, well, what I call frequently asked questions. I hope that's a meaningful way to start. We have the EPA, hooray, between Europe and Japan, but why so late? And what is an EPA? What's the difference to a free trade agreement? What are the specific provision. We are going to go into details, of course, later on, but let me start with an overview. What are the early experiences and what's the difference to the SPA, the Strategic Partnership Agreement, and what is early work in that field? So for some of you, this may be very simple to answer those questions, but we have a wide audience, so maybe a good idea to go about it like this. Now, why and why so late? I mean, EU and Japan make up approximately 30% of global GDP and 40% of world trade. So Japan is one of the most important trading partners of the EU, the second largest in Asia, the seventh largest in the world. And the EU is also Japan's third most important trading partners. Both EPA and SPA started to be operative in February 2019. So why so late? Well, when we look at about a decade ago, we see that most countries were still interested in wider multilateral mechanisms, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Partnership, also the WTO. But then, as we all know, many things happened. We have new powers entering the stage with their own ideas of influencing the international order, like China. We had a change of leadership 4 years ago in the United States. As you recall, the United States dropped out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership idea. So both Japan and the EU reappraised the importance of a trade pact between the two of them. And I give you two quotes which show that both countries or country groups are actually very close together in their ideas. Here's a quote from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan, which sees the EPA as a model of economic order in the 21st century based on free and fair rules. And in the EU Global Strategy of 2016, we find a fairly similar idea. Our prosperity hinges on an open and rules-based economic system with a true level playing field, which our economic diplomacy will further promote. Okay, that's I was talking about the EPA, but that will actually be our first contribution be about. Julie Gilson will speak on the wider context of the Strategic Partnership Agreement soon, and she will talk about how this came about, how this has to be seen on the background of other endeavors. Second question, why an economic partnership agreement, not a free trade area? Well, that's fairly simple because EPA is a wider concept. It's not only about abolishing tariffs and other tariff or non-tariff barriers, but it goes beyond. And to see how it goes beyond, let's have a look at the structure of the EU-Japan EPA. That's it like, and sorry for leaving out the appendices in this list. You see that it's fairly broad and issues like corporate governance come up, transparency or sustainable development, which definitely go beyond FTA. Now, if we cannot go through all the chapters, but let me just give you a feeling for some of the important provisions of the EPA. Of course, it lowers tariffs, and it depends a little bit on the time frame we are talking about, but we are talking about well over 90% of all tariff items that will be abolished over the time. For instance, in industrial products, they will be fully liberalized. In agri-food, it's somewhat lower. So we have geographical indications that will be safeguarded for things like Irish whiskey in Japan, or on the other hand, for Japanese rice wine stuff here in Europe. Obviously, we have reduction in non-tariff barriers as well. For instance, standard setting. Both have promised to apply international standards for motor vehicles to alleviate trade in motor vehicles. And we have significant parts on sustainable development, labor standards, Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, the Paris Climate Goals, they are also mentioned. And we actually have something which will lead to a dialogue with civil society about such topics. Investment, yes, the EPA supports investment, but it does not include an investment protection agreement so far. And finally, I would like to mention that we have to see the EPA as an ongoing process. For instance, when you talk about standards, well, there's technological change, so you have to keep discussing. So there's not only a joint committee meeting once a year, but there are 10 other committees and working groups are established as well. What are the early experiences? Well, as I said, it started in February 2019. So if we want to see some results, might be fairly easy to compare trade in 2019 with trade in 2018. And here you see the figures and you realize that trade in both directions has increased by more than 3 billion euros in each direction. So we have a rise of some 6% during a single year. But is it really attributable to the EPA or maybe other developments as well? Well, here's some more piece of evidence that frequently referred to. This is a news release from the EU Commission when we had the first anniversary of the EPA. And they basically give similar numbers and break them down. For instance, meat exports from the EU increased by 12% during the first year. I mean, that sounds really nice, but the question remains, is it attributable to the EPA? Now, this is something that Jens WRONA will focus on in the second presentation by using the analytical concepts of economics. And I would also like to alert you that this will also be an important topic of next week's symposiums when we hear the voices of politics and business, both from a European and from a Japanese side. Okay, let's leave the EPA. Let's talk about the SPA. This is even wider. This is a further extension. It's wider than the EPA because it covers topics among like-minded global partners, as it's called in the Strategic Partnership Agreement. It's like-minded global partners. So it covers, if you look at Article 1, political and sectoral, well, we could say economic, sectoral, business, cooperations and joint actions in areas of common interest, even going beyond the two areas. So it includes regional and global challenges. And again, here we find the idea that the like-minded partners want to come together for the promotion of shared values and principles, in particular, democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and fundamental freedoms. Some issues are cybercrime, disaster management, energy security, climate change, aging population. So it's a huge, again, agenda. SPA also started provisionally in February 2019. Provisionally is important because it's actually not only an agreement between EU and Japan, but because there are so many issues involved where jurisdiction is different, all the EU members have to agree to the full set of SPA, but some work could start already. And which work started already is the so-called EU-Japan Partnership on Sustainable Connectivity and Quality Infrastructure, which was signed in 2019 in September. And it wants to deal with all issues of connectivity, bilateral and multilaterally. So going beyond the nations, for instance, in Central Asia, but also in South Asia, Africa, elsewhere, including digital transport, energy, people-to-people exchange. And this is really the first major focus, as has been pointed out in the second yearly meeting of the SPA Joint Committee, which treated this as the focus. So this is really important. And we have two contributions covering that. Yoshino Sensei, Professor Yoshino, whom I didn't see before, but now I see him. Welcome, Professor Yoshino as well. Professor Yoshino will talk about specific ideas, for instance, in the area of finance. And Dr. OKANO-HEIJMANS will discuss SPA with various issues, what it could imply in the future. So this is the program we want to deal with, and we move forward to the presentations. But before doing so, well, let me do some small commercial again, and I would like to alert you once more to the other part of the conference, which will take place next week on Thursday. So let's start with the first presentation, and whoops, too many papers on my desk. Well, let me first start by introducing Julie Gilson from the University of Birmingham, Political Science, International Relations. She got a doctorate degree from Sheffield University. She has written extensively on the international relations, Japan's international policy, EU-Japan relations, and she is now engaged in sustainable development issues at Birmingham University as well, and part of the Birmingham Plastics Group, particularly interested in a sustainable future for plastic. Julie, we are very happy to have you here, and the next 20 minutes are yours.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me. I hope you can all hear me. It's very timely, and there's a lot to review, so I'm happy to be part of a much greater field of expertise here. What I'm really interested in for this short presentation is thinking about the Strategic Partnership Agreement in a longer term perspective. And I've drawn on issues of path dependency. And what I mean by that is referring to the significant academic literature that we get from historical institutionalism, which rests on the basic assumption that past decisions about institutionalization and design and purpose can have significant consequences for future actions over time. Thus, drawing on the work of people like Hay and Wincott, path dependence is the idea that strategic choices made at a particular moment eliminate possibilities for later. So I'm going to show you a PowerPoint presentation, which I hope you'll be able to see. Please let me know if you can't. And let me... There we go. And it's for us now to think about whether that path dependence is what we're seeing, particularly in terms of the SPA, which, as Werner said, is the broader of the two agreements, is much looser and norm-driven than the more tangible outcomes of the Economic Partnership Agreement, which my colleagues will talk about shortly. So I want to think about path dependency in terms of how habits and routines and types of behavior become embedded into particular contexts. I'm not going to say more about that here. I'm happy to talk about it in Q&A or anytime, but it's worth thinking about what happens even through the path-breaking EPA and SPA. We see modes of operation that we've seen for a very long time between Japan and the EU. And as Werner's already said, the historic EPA was signed in 2018, and alongside it came this Strategic Partnership Agreement. It wasn't the first partnership agreement, but its contents are important for reflecting on where the EU and Japan find themselves today. And although I don't have time to go into all the details of my findings, without wanting to publicize my book flagrantly, I have just finished a book on looking at this EPA and SPA together in terms of thinking about multilateralism, which I'll come back to as well. So in essence, the EPA can be tracked as a cumulative set of experiences. and chart the experiences from an economic perspective, but more challenging in my view with the changing normative frames of reference upon which EU-Japan relations had historically been based. And I would argue that it became evident during the 2010s, in fact, during that period of negotiation, that the world was changing and how the EU and Japan found themselves within it was also changing. And you can see that if you look at the origins of the negotiations themselves, the negotiators did not set out with the expectation that they would have the kinds of agreement that they found themselves with in 2018, which were much further reaching than they'd anticipated. And two fundamental premises were starting to unravel. And one was the global liberal trading order and the rights-based multilateral system for coordinating approaches to peace and security. And I think we can see this normative transformation happening as types of multilateral approaches upon which both the EU and Japan and collectively had depended were no longer looking as secure as they previously had. I'm happy again to talk about that more in Q&A if you're interested. But the SPA covered a wide range of areas of common interest, broadly capturing politics and security and confirming mutual commitment to the preservation of international peace and democratic values, as Werner highlighted a moment ago. And whilst it was long on rhetoric, there have as yet been very few signs of tangible actions in its name, except for the connectivity agreement, which I'll come to in a moment. And this process of general normative context is one that we see going far back to the Hague Declaration of 1991 between the EU and Japan. This promised commitments to democratic rights and principles, nevertheless has struggled to find a way to come out with meaningful, tangible outcomes that are specifically around what the EU and Japan can do together. The Connectivity Initiative then is the focus of this presentation. And to what extent does it offer a novel form of governance in the context of that changing multilateral environment? Particularly, I think we recognize that it's aimed at challenging or questioning China's modus operandi in its own Belt and Road Initiative. And to what extent does it demonstrate that the aspirations of the strategic partnership are being put into practice? And what then does it tell us about whether past-dependent behavior is becoming something that we can see as having more plasticity, so more freedom to move, less tightness to that historical dependency? So at its first meeting in Tokyo in March 2019, the Joint Committee, one of the committees that Werner's just mentioned, set up to deliver the SPA between Japan and the EU. And it covered security, climate change, nuclear disarmament, infrastructure development as priority areas. Again, we've heard this kind of broad-based brushstroke before. And these built, as I say, on engagements and commitments by Japan and its member states in a whole range of forums. And the challenge for the EU and Japan is to demonstrate what value added their own partnership brings, excuse me, to these issues. The SPA then is a normative, in my view, a normative support structure for the EPA and resonates with the shared values of both partners, focusing on transparency, democratic principles, and the like. And fundamentally, it roots the EU and Japan in the broader international interactions in which they engage. As noted already, though, it risks in its broad coverage losing the depth that it might need. So we might argue that it's aspiration heavy, but only light in its results. There's a caveat, and it's a very tragic caveat for me, and it's the Brexit caveat. And it's worth reminding ourselves that what constitutes the EU today itself has changed since the signature of the SPA, as the UK, through its Brexit decision, has left the Union. In terms of the EPA in particular, it remains to be seen what the EU newly signed UK-Japan economic agreement brings in practice. And we don't know what's going to happen with the UK's deal or no deal Brexit by 31st of December. some of us are waiting with bated breath to find out. But the UK, what's important for Japan is that the UK has been a gateway to Europe, and how it can retain that gateway status outside the EU without an agreement is unclear. In terms of the SPA, it remains to be seen what any UK political and security leverage might look like. And in the past few days, indeed hours, in the wake of Joe Biden's victory in the US election, it's clear that from the US foreign policy position, the United Kingdom is going to have to work very hard to retain interest as any kind of special relationship with the US without its former links to the European Union. So all of that is a caveat to say we're not actually sure what the EU now looks and feels like in its entirety. But getting back to my earlier question is that the connectivity and quality infrastructure project, it doesn't appear out of thin air. It's built on a collection of previous agreements, including the 2019 G20 Principles for Quality Infrastructure Investment, the EU's own connectivity strategy, Japanese strategies. We can name rather a long list of them, actually. And it follows initiatives like the Japan-India Asia-Africa Growth Corridor of 2017, the US-Japan-Australia Blue Dot Network of 2019, and shows clear signs of path dependence on building on those agreements. It aims to do infrastructure better. And here again, it takes a very firm normative line to pay attention to quality over quantity, and paraphrasing former Japanese Prime Minister Abe, to do infrastructure in this improved way. And that's a clear sign to the infrastructure agreements outlined by China. The agreement states that Japan and the EU intend to work together on all dimensions of connectivity, bilaterally and multilaterally, including digital, transport, energy, and people-to-people exchange. Both sides would continue their cooperation in areas such as hydrogen and fuel cells, electricity market regulation, and the global market for liquefied natural gas, supporting sustainable energy connectivity, for example, by building on the existing Japan-EU energy dialogue. And they intend to discuss things like sustainable energy infrastructure investments with a view to strengthening regional and global energy markets, and looking at the transformation to low carbon energy systems. So one of the things I'm particularly interested in is the Sustainable Development Chapter of the EPA, and how it's reinforced by those normative bases within the SPA. And this very much speaks to that agenda, and I think is where the value added for Japan and the EU can really come from. What's interesting is that, as Werner mentioned also, the geographical focus particularly draws our attention to the Western Balkans, the Eastern European states, Central Asia, Indo-Pacific, as well as Africa. And in so doing, aims to reaffirm those shared democratic values of both sides and to emphasize that sustainability. The finances are yet to be worked out, but underpinning the agreement, the EU has proposed 60 billion euro to the EU-Asia Connectivity Plan, as well as 123 billion euro between 2021 and 2030 to the Asian region overall. And loans through these schemes are to be provided by memos of understanding between the European Investment Bank and the Japanese Bank for International Cooperation, the Nippon Export and Investment Insurance Group, and the Japanese International Cooperation Agency. So you can see it's a public-private state, non-state investment opportunity. And for people like observers like Chotani, this agreement really offers a credible alternative, unquote, to the anticipated $1 trillion US investment under the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And we'll return to that in a moment. Now, I'm not about to try and compete with the excellent job that Werner PASCHA and Minako Morita Jaeger have respectively done in their in-depth assessments of this connectivity agreement. And I would strongly urge you to read their work if you're interested in this topic. My aim here is to signal simply three points around the agreement. And it's to do with this notion of path dependency and to show that we really are not starting new territory here. The first point then is to locate this agreement not simply with the EU-Japan framework, but also with its Asia-Europe foundations. And this is interesting in part because the Asia-Europe meeting, which started in 1996, had a rather narrow geographical focus, and it's now become global, and with the exception of Africa, covers most of the states that the connectivity agreement is trying to cover. And many of the principles of the new agreement, the connectivity agreement, are already bound within that ASEM EU Asia-Europe framework. And this has a benefit of a workable path-dependent model of cooperation, and the connectivity agenda within ASEM is already clearly articulated. Thus, for example, through the cooperation framework of 2000, ASEM connectivity aimed to cover all modes of transport, and also included institution, infrastructure, financial cooperation, IT, digital, energy. So we see the same terminology and the same bases for cooperation actually are already articulated 20 years ago. And interestingly, ASEM connectivity covers all three pillars of ASEM, which means economic, security, economic, political, and socio-cultural. And we see here that one of the things that I'm not going to speak about, but the people-to-people exchange is fundamental to this agreement. What the ASEM connectivity agreement aimed is to be results-oriented and support the key principles of having a level playing field, free and open trade, market principles, multidimensionality, fairness, transparency, and so on. And the goals and targets of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainability, for Sustainable Development were very much at the forefront of ambitions then. So I think this is interesting to see how the parameters of the current agreement are already in existence. As I've already mentioned, I'm very interested in thinking about how multilateralism functions today. And so my second point to make is that the nature, in my view, the nature of multilateralism has changed, not least over the past 15 years or so with the proliferation of bilateral and localized regional free trade agreements. And it's something I've explored in my book, but my own view is that the erosion of historical forms of multilateralism offer both constraints and opportunity. And this agreement here, I think, illustrates both of those areas. As one example of change, the idea of an Indo-Pacific is very much gaining currency among political and economic leaders. And this connectivity agreement recognizes how new forms of regional multilateral narratives are actually shaping, and acknowledges the need to move away from traditional partnerships and traditional or accepted ideas, perhaps of Asia-Pacific in particular. And leading issues notably around climate change and environmental degradation really demand this new approach. But a move away from previous incarnations of multilateralism is inherent here. And the linchpin is around this set of norms. And clearly China is offering a different model in that respect. So if we look at the third point is actually about China. And Chotani's point is the EU and Japan are offering a different model. I think that might be somewhat premature, but I think there are signs of something significant here. And so the third point I'd like to make is to underline that bridging position of Japan and the EU, sitting as they still do at a junction between the continued growing power of China and a wavering US in global affairs. I don't have the time to look into the latter in this presentation, and as I was preparing the presentation, the exciting US election was unfolding. But it also seems to me to be clear that for at least for the short term, Joe Biden's work is going to be focused on repairing domestic or addressing domestic challenges in particular. And it's not clear what the Asia position is going to look like. But it's important to evaluate the extent to which the Connectivity Initiative purports to offer a viable governance mechanism, an alternative to the Chinese BRI. Japan itself has tried to balance China's investments in the region and beyond, and its loan efforts by offering 110 billion US dollars, for example, through its high quality investment initiatives, and developing partnerships with the US and Australia too. And the Japanese government under former Prime Minister Abe stressed the need for these principles to be applied to debt burdens as well as to environmental and labour standards. And it especially underlines the normative synergies between Japan and the EU, which is seen in the sustainability chapter. I'm going to skip a little bit on because I'm going to run out of time and I don't want to overstay my welcome. But there's a recognition that the EU and Japan, with a new agreement in place, offer the opportunity to balance the competing demands of a rising China and declining foreign hegemonic power of the US. And this gives these two partners the chance to address the erosion of multilateralism in a very novel way. And the contrast with the Chinese model emphasizes high standard connectivity initiatives, high quality and sustainable connectivity. And it's important that these normative underpinnings are actually at the heart of the enterprise here. In these ways, then the connectivity agreement maps on to past dependent behaviors. But actually what's interesting for me too is that the new point of origin, the history, if you like, starts now from the EPA and the SPA, and the types of initiative of the Hague Declaration have now been supplanted by these very important agreements, which speak as the new origins for EU-Japan relations more broadly. Again, I'm not going to go into that now because I won't have time, but I'm happy to take that up. It does speak to me for a greater need for plasticity in the current era more than ever before, responding to events, global crises, from the long-term prospects of climate change and the need for sustainable development to addressing shared responses to pandemics like COVID-19. And China's approach to the BRI at the moment perpetuates problems around a lack of sustainability in international agreements. I really am going to move on here and say there's 2 points though that are really important. And one point is there's playing catch up with China, making inroads into the same countries that China's BRI is reaching out to. But it can't be, point one is it can't be empty rhetoric. It can't be promises alone. And Japan and the EU will have to supply significant resources to meet their commitments to this connectivity ambition and the resources to meet their ambition for the SPA more broadly. And one problem is that the provisions of the SPA oblige the parties to encourage cooperation between the EU and Japan and focus on cooperation rather than on those concrete actions. The second point, which I think Werner has raised in his work as well, is that there's a need to work with China, not against China. These global challenges require joined up thinking, and a competitive agenda will get us so far, but actually we see with the COVID crisis that there's a need for additional work together. I was going to talk about the fact that the financial unsustainability of the BRI itself is also in question. I'm not going to focus on it here again, I'll happily come back to it. And there's also a lack of greening in the BRI. So the challenges within China's own model are also a problem for China, not just for Chinese recipients of Chinese investment, but for Chinese insurers themselves. And the one thing that has shown that is COVID-19, and that's what I want to finish on now. I think the COVID crisis offers avenues for this kind of cooperation. It's exposed weaknesses in, for example, supply chains, repayment schemes, and those debts and debt for those countries drawing on China's BRI, and those supply chains being too dependent on China have raised a number of problems for recipient countries. It's also increased US-China tensions, and Japan can re-emphasize its values in the light of COVID. And for Chotani, and I agree here, COVID-19 has been a wake-up call for Tokyo to push through on refocusing on quality infrastructure lending around the world. Earlier this year, the EU and Japan pledged to coordinate responses to the virus through various forms of collaboration around diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines, among other, and to link up Japan's Moonshot Research and Development Programme with the EU's Horizon Programme. Promoting this within international fora such as the G20 and the UN system allows for Japan and the EU to take a lead on strengthening response capacities, sharing information in a prompt and transparent manner, and participating in major organizations such as the World Health Organization. It goes without saying that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and it remains to be seen if here too Japan and the EU are able to channel significant investment and significant targeted opportunities. But my conclusion is that there's a compelling story of norm promotion here that has been built on a history of relations over many centuries, over many decades, but we're waiting for resource allocation to be clarified. There's a clear need to look for greater collaboration, including with China, and not competition. But as Axel Berkowski notes in his work, the devil is in the detail, and Brussels and Tokyo are now charged with some of the tasks of following up with substance and policies in order to extinguish some of the proverbial fires in international politics and security. And with Axel's words, I'll end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julie, showing us the historical background, but also the wider international background. We definitely have to see everything also on the basis of what goes on elsewhere in the US, China, and so on. And now we're going to look at the EPA in more detail, and it will be Jens WRONA, who is from our institute. That he's a new professor since 2019, a new professor for new economic geography and East Asia. In addition, he is a research network member of the IFO Institute of Economic Research in Munich and of the Düsseldorf Institute for Competition Economics. He has a background with a doctoral degree in economics from Tübingen University, and he does very interesting work, for instance, on the spatial, the space of the different regions of the Japanese economy, which is not our topic here, but in international terms, he will now introduce us to analytical aspects to analyze possible results of the EPA. And the word is yours, Jens.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Could you clear the screen that I can share my presentation with you? Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so here we go. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction. A warm welcome also from my side here. What I'm going to present to you is an overview on how to estimate the economic impact of the EU-Japan Economic Partnership Agreement. And right up front, I think it's fair to say that right now it's difficult to have some first evidence based on the relatively short amount of time that this partnership agreement is into place. So what I thought might be useful instead is to show you a bit more of the details of how this is generally done. So how do trade economists actually evaluate free trade agreements? And we're going to look at some forecasts for the EPA which gives us some rough idea about the numbers. We already have seen that trade flows have gone up. So is what we casually observed today in line with the predictions. And then maybe we can discuss about a few of the challenges that will be there when finally enough time has elapsed to fully evaluate the consequences of the economic partnership agreement. And I think some challenges exist always, and I'm happy to point that out, but I think right now in the current situation, there have some new challenges arise that make the identification, quantification of these trade agreements, and particularly the EU-Japan trade agreement, more difficult than usual, and I think this is what we are heading for. So the big question here is obviously, what have economists to say on the EU-Japan trade agreement? And I would say we have to say a lot, because there are two things that made significant progress during the last decade, and that is first the estimation of the effects of free trade agreements in general, and also the quantification of general equilibrium effects. So we are not only able to say, okay, a certain trade cost reduction has a certain effect on the trade flows between two countries, but we can also say how this then affects general equilibrium outcomes, not only for Japan and the EU, but also for all the other countries in the world. And I'm gonna focus a bit on this in this presentation. Okay, so the main question here is, how can these new insights be used to quantify the economic effects of the EPA? And we will also see that there have been quite some there had been quite some progress on this, and I'm gonna be happy to point out where actually the progress is. Okay, so this is a quick outlook for the presentation today. I'm gonna start right from the beginning. So what do we know about international trade? I'm gonna show you the tool that is mainly used today in order to estimate and to quantify the effects of for example, international trade agreements. We then gonna look at how to quantify the general equilibrium effects of trade policy in general, and then look at the prediction that we have for the EPA right now, talking about the challenges of the ex post evaluation that's going to come in the next years. And then we quickly address current issues like Brexit, COVID, and how this is going to be determine, eventually shape the future of the EPA. Okay. So let's start with some stylized facts on international trade. I think many of you know this, but obviously one first important stylized fact that you can find always in the data is that bilateral trade is proportional to market size. Okay, so what does it mean? So what I'm showing you here is the following. You see here Japan's exports to EU and Japan's import to EU for 2006. So it's all data, but never mind. This hasn't changed really. What you see here is the following. Okay, it's the size of the Japanese exports, the size of the Japanese imports compared to the size of the trading partner. Okay, so we have here trade between Japan and different EU countries. Yeah, and what we see is that, of course, if you have a large country like Germany and you have a small country like Malta, Germany has more trade, okay? And actually, the trade that it has in excess of Malta is proportional to the size. So Germany being 10 times larger than Greece, like here the reference point in this graph is, also has exactly 10 times more trade with Japan than Greece, okay? And why is this comparison here a useful one? Now, by comparing different EU countries and their trade with Japan, we always have more or less the same distance, okay? So if you're shipping your goods around half of the world, it doesn't matter whether you have to go another 200 kilometers to go from Germany to France. So that is not really the big difference here. And we see for equal distance, what determines the size of the trade flow is then the size of the trading partner. Okay, so that's the first stylized fact that is observed not only for trade with Japan, but that holds generally true for all trade relationships in the world, okay? What's the second important stylized fact you need to know about trade is that the volume of trade, the value of trade, is inversely proportional to geographic and other frictions, and most notably distance, okay? So what do we see here? Here we have, again, export and imports. Now it's the export and imports of France, because this is kind of a nice example to focus on. I will show you why. Normalized by the size of the trading partner. So size effects that you have seen in the previous figure have been accounted for. And now what you see is this normalized trade here is inversely related to distance, okay? So the further away a trading partner here or here, yeah, the lower is the trade volume that you will observe with a specific country, in this case, as I said, France. But you see it's not only distance, okay? So for example, here, the green observations and the ones with the red cycles, these are former colonies of France, or countries which today still speaking French. And you see, okay, to some account, this can make up for larger distances. So even if you have a large distance to that country, if you share the same language or if you share the same history, you typically will have more trade with your trading partner. So you see, frictions here are not only geographic frictions. So this could be frictions in many dimensions. That could be language frictions. These could be institutional frictions. And all these things basically predict the trade volume. And what you see is that if countries are generally more similar in geography and distance, in their institutions, in their language, etc., 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 you will see that these countries are going to have more trade. And one important predictor is, of course, distance. Okay. Now, if you put these two stylized facts together, the question is, how can we explain them? Yeah, and the good news is that research has found a formula to do that, a very simple one. It's a gravity equation. Okay, and what does the gravity equation tell you? Now, that's what you see here as a rule of thumb. What you can say is that the bilateral trade volume between two countries, okay, is proportional to the size of their markets, more specifically the product of the sizes of their markets, divided by the distance between these two markets. And it's called gravity equation because it has obviously an analog in physics, where we have a gravity equation to describe the gravitational force between two objects, and the similar relationship holds true for trade. And if you now think, okay, so this is what the scientific process looks like in economics, I can tell you absolutely not, but I nevertheless like the picture. Okay, so let's move on and look a bit more into detail what this gravity equation tells us. And here again, you have this comparison between Newton's law of universal gravitation, which, as I said before, tells you what is the force of attraction between two objects of weight m, I and mj, and then it's divided by the distance to the square, and this gives you a description of the gravitational force between two masses, of course. Yeah. For international trade, a surprisingly similar relationship has been established, first empirically. Now, in the last decade, a lot of theoretical models are actually able to produce this relationship, and what it tells you is that the volume of bilateral trade, the value of bilateral trade is proportional to the size of the trading partners. So this is the aggregate supply of the exporter times the aggregate demand, the aggregate expenditure of the importer, divided by a term here which captures all bilateral friction. So this is a measure for the total trade cost between these two countries. Looks a bit complicated, and now what we want to do is have a closer look into that to understand what this formula actually tells us. Okay, so here it is again. This is our gravity equation. These two terms here, they are called the multilateral resistance terms. They look a bit complicated. I'm going to show you in a second what they actually mean. Okay, but let's start with the simple things. The first component, let's focus on this here. Okay, so this is the component of a gravity equation in a world where you do not have any frictions, no geography, no distance, no language barriers. Okay, so you can trade without any cost with any trading partner. Okay, and then the bilateral trade volume would be only determined by the size of the two trading partners. Okay, China, US, two large economies, a lot of trade. Okay, Belgium, Luxembourg, two small economies, little trade. Okay, that's quite intuitive, I think. More interestingly is now to take a look at this trade cost component here, and this trade cost component has again three components, and we start here with the TIJ. And the TIJ, this is the bilateral trade cost between two countries, okay? So this is like the bilateral distance. That is whether you share a language or not, whether you have the same institutions, whether you have the same colonial history, whether or not you have a free trade agreement, or how large are the import tariffs that you levy on your mutual imports, yeah? And this is really just what determines the relationship of these two trading partners. But you see there are two other terms that are in here. And I mentioned them before. This is what people call the multilateral resistant terms. So let's have a closer look at the first one. That is what we call the outward multilateral resistant terms. Okay. And what you can imagine this is that's a measure of how easy it is for you to trade not with the specific trading partner we're looking at, but with all the other countries in the world. Okay. And in order to explain these terms, I always like to use a nice analogy. So think, for example, about Germany and France as two trading partners. And now you move these two countries from the middle of Europe to the middle of the Pacific Ocean. What do you expect to happen? Do they trade more or do they trade less? They're going to trade more because they now have less trading partners around them if they could alternatively trade. So they have to trade more with each other instead. And that's exactly what these terms capture. So you can think of them as how easy it is for you as a country to export to the world, to the rest of the world, and how difficult it is for you to import from the rest of the world. So these are measures for the average cost of exporting, and these are basically the average cost of importing, and they basically tell you about all the effects that the other trading partners to which you can also resort to do your trade will have on your bilateral trade with a specific country, okay? So maybe to give you another analogy from physics, so if you think about physics, there we know that the tides that we can observe at the Earth, yeah, depends on the size of the Earth, the size of the Moon, and the distance between the Moon and the Earth, okay? But if you more closely look into that, you can also measure other effects. You can measure effect of having the Venus around or the Mars. So other planets also have an effect on the size of the tides on the Earth. They are small, of course, but they are there, okay? And with trade, it's the same. So the trade between Germany and Japan, or the EU and Japan, of course, depends whether China is big or China is small, yeah? And all these effects are conveniently captured here by two simple summary measures, and you can imagine them basically just as size-weighted averages over the trade cost of trading with all the other countries around the world, okay? And I'm going to show you why these terms are going to be important, because these are the terms through which general equilibrium effects will be channeled, okay? So how to explain that in more detail? Now think about a free trade agreement. Let's say a free trade agreement between the EU and Japan. What this will happen is it will have a direct effect at the bilateral trade cost between these two blocks of countries. Yeah. So imagine you now introduce an FTA or you abolish all the tariffs. That will reduce the bilateral trade cost between the EU and Japan. And as a consequence, we will see that given that there are low restrictions to trade, there should be more trade. So that is a partial equilibrium direct effect of this free trade agreement. But that's not the only effect, okay? So there are also general equilibrium effects, and the first general equilibrium effects materialize because if you lower the trade costs, okay, you also change your multilateral resistant terms, okay? So if you reduce the trade cost between the EU and Japan, this will also have effects on the trade of all the other countries. You will have trade diversion effects, and they operate through these multilateral resistant terms. And that is not the only effect. So for example, if you change now the market access that the country has to the world market, the country might change its prices, and that changes the aggregate income of the country. So there's a second round general equilibrium effect where we see that then also the size of the economies in terms of actual aggregate production and aggregate expenditures change, and this will also have ultimately a feedback effect on the bilateral trade volume. Okay, so the bilateral trade volume, let's say of EU and Japan, depends on the direct effect of changing the bilateral trade cost, on the indirect effect of changing basically the average trade cost in the world, and it depends then on the reaction of those countries' aggregate production and aggregate expenditure, which depends on how easy it is to trade within the world. Okay. And this not only holds for EU, Japan, for other countries, you won't have the direct effect, okay, non-member countries, but you still have the indirect effect, okay? Now, to give you an idea how all these effects materialize, if you put numbers to these equations, I brought you a very simple example. It's not the EU-Japan trade agreement, it's another trade agreement, it's NAFTA. So why it's NAFTA? Because this is arguably one of the most important trade agreements, and it's one of the trade agreements that has been studied the most and which is most well understood, okay? So I'm going to show you also some number on the EU-Japan trade agreement later, but now let's focus on this simple example just to understand what's going on, okay? So remember, this is a trade agreement between US, Canada, and Mexico. So if we look at the partial equilibrium effects, we see that export increase among those countries, okay, because those countries entered an FTA and lowered their trade costs, okay? The partial equilibrium effect doesn't materialize for any outside country which is not member of this free trade agreement, so no partial equilibrium effects for the rest of the world, okay? Now let's have a look at general equilibrium. In general equilibrium, we see two things. First, the partial equilibrium effects that we had before for the member countries are now smaller. Why? Now, because if you make it easier to trade between US and Canada, this diverts some trade away from Canada from Canada and Mexico and from the US and Mexico. So you have some feedback effects which dampen the partial equilibrium effect for the member countries, but you also have some trade diversion from the rest of the world. So what you see here is basically, if it's getting easier to trade between US and Canada and Mexico and US and Mexico, some trade is diverted away from these member countries trading with the EU or Asia or other parts of the world towards trading among them, okay? And that is why other countries, non-member countries, see a reduction in their trade flows, particularly with these member countries, okay? And that is what every free trade agreement predicts. You're gonna have positive effects for the member countries typically, and you're typically going to have negative but small effects for all the non-member countries. Okay, and you're going to see later that for Japan, it's for the EU-Japan trade agreement, it's pretty much the same. So these export effects translate into GDP effects.
5 minutes left, right?
Okay, so going to speed up. So you have the same thing for in GDP, and maybe now let's move forward to EU-Japan trade agreement. Okay. So there's a study which has quantified that. I'm going to basically look at this prediction. What's new here is they use the previously introduced EU-Korean free trade agreement to get estimates on the FTA effects, so the effects of reducing non-tariff barriers. Tariff barriers we can measure, non-tariff barriers difficult to measure, so we use basically this agreement as a prediction on how this affects the trade of the EU trade agreement. So these were the tariffs of EU-Japan before, already relatively low. We're going to see that they had little effect because they were so low in the beginning. There's some heterogeneity in these numbers, which you can't see because it's aggregated to sector level, but they were generally quite low. Okay. Now, what they do is, and I don't go into detail, they basically estimate the effect of having a reduction in non-tariff barriers. And they do this by identifying a residual component in the bilateral trade flows that change after introducing the free trade agreement of here between EU and Korea. And this residual component allows you to quantify basically the effect that having this free trade agreement on the trade flow. So you see, this is basically the implied increase in trade. That's for EU-Korea, yeah, by having the free trade agreement, by having a reduction in non-tariff barriers. Okay, and you see sizable effects, more trade because non-tariff barriers disappear. And you see that these effects are much larger than what you would expect from reducing the already very small tariffs. And that's what you see then in the number. So these are the predictions of how the real income changes after introducing the EU-Japan free trade agreement. There's several scenarios. Let's focus on scenario 1, which is really just the agreement. And then you see, okay, positive effects for member countries, for Japan, for large members of the EU, UK, Germany, France, okay? And we see small, almost negligible effects for non-member countries. So the largest negative effects are for countries which are close to Japan, therefore have a lot of trade, but are not member of this new free trade agreement, for example, Taiwan, yeah, but also China. As I said, so these effects are really tiny. This is the composition of these effects, and we see, okay, where are the gains coming from? They're actually coming from the abolishment of non-tariff barriers, okay? Tariffs were low to begin with, therefore, little effect of reducing these tariffs. Most of the variation really comes here from having a reduction in non-tariff barriers. That's true for Japan, that's true for the EU, and that is what we would expect, okay? So now what we are waiting for is more data. Okay, it's far too early to quantify basically the effect of the EU trade agreement, given that we only have now roughly 2 years this agreement into effect. Typically, we will need some more years. Typically, what people find is that the effects of free trade agreement unfold over a period of approximately 5 years. So we need more time. And then there will be some challenges in identifying these effects. Some of these challenges are always there. Typically, we have not these free trade agreements falling down from heaven. That's what we heard before. So there was a process, there was a decision, and there was a specific decision about the timing when these negotiations speeded up. And this is, of course, an issue here. If this is correlated with the economic fundamentals that we observe, it's difficult to isolate the pure effect of introducing free trade agreement. The non-tariff barriers, or the effect of these non-tariff barriers, okay, they're identified based on residuals. There's always the problem that they might pick up other things that happen at the same time. So you might having pick up, for example, a general convergence between Japan and the EU that was ongoing anyways. And finally, and this is maybe the biggest issue that we are having to face when evaluating the ex post the effects of the EU-Japan economic partnership agreement, is that due to the COVID pandemic, we see a lot of changes actually now in bilateral trade costs. Okay, it's not so much the problem that we have large GDP shocks in many countries around the world. It's really about the bilateral trade costs that change. So we have travel restrictions placed. We had higher trade costs within the EU due to some lockdowns and so on and so on. And given all this, it's going to be really difficult to single out what is now the effect of these trade agreement in lowering the trade costs between these partner countries. Okay. And finally, one thing that also matters, I think, in particular for this specific trade agreement, the model that I've shown you so far was a model that only focused on international trade. The truth is, however, that Japan, particularly Japan, does a lot of FDI and serves other markets, not only through exporting, but also through tariff jumping FDI. And therefore, a complete picture would actually be a model which not only accounts for trade, but simultaneously also counts for multinational production and a possible substitution away from FDI back to international trade if trade now becomes more attractive. Okay. Some last words on Brexit. What the predictions show is that Brexit has a small effect on Japan. So the gains, of course, are smaller because Japan gets access to a smaller area if the UK is no longer a member of the EU, of course. On the other hand, the effects of Brexit on the gains for the EU from the EU-Japan trade agreement, they are almost negligible. Okay, so Brexit, of course, has an effect on the EU as such, but not on the gains from this trade agreement between the EU and the Japan. So here the effects are really negligible. Okay, now one last word on COVID. So the question is, now we observe COVID, people have raised the question, is that basically a signal that we should stop with globalization? Should we have a process of renationalization? Is this already going on? And is COVID basically one important signal that tells us, okay, we have gone too far and there are benefits of redoing parts of the globalization process that we observed during the last decades? One recent study has basically looked into that, and what they conclude, no, it's not the COVID it's not that international trade magnifies the COVID consequences, in particular the lockdown effects and the economic decline in these countries. The issue here is the following: COVID is already everywhere, okay, and every country is struck in its domestic market. It's not that the transmission between these countries through international trade is the important issue. It's that COVID has struck most of the biggest economies in the world around the world directly, and whether these countries are connected or not really doesn't matter if they are all struck by the same shock. Okay, so it's not that COVID necessarily tells you should have less free trade agreements in the future. Okay, so let me quickly wrap up. What we see as moderate overall gains, that's due to the fact that we have long distance and that trade only is a part of the economy. It's about 30% over here. It's less in Japan. We wouldn't expect gigantic effect of free trade agreements. We see that the gains are larger for Japan. That makes sense because we have an asymmetry here in the size of these trading partners, of course. We have relatively small third country effects for non-member countries. So this free trade agreement is really not a threat, not a major threat to any non-member country, but that holds true for most free trade agreements. So the third country effects are typically not so large. And we see that non-tariff barriers, they are responsible for the action. It's not that the reduction in already low tariffs was responsible for large effects here. So what we see probably is due to reduction in non-tariff barriers. Okay, for the future, of course, what's important here is how the situation between US and China changes in the future. Whether we're going to see a general deglobalization trend, well, this is happening. And of course, the future of deep trade agreements. So do we see a return to multilateralism, see we free trade agreements, which also have a lot of other stuff in there, and most notably, which is not the case for the EU-Japan trade agreement now, whether we have bilateral investment treaties, so whether we see also investment protection and things like this going on. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to join the discussion with you afterwards.
Right. Thank you very much, Jens, for showing us what trade models can do, but also where there are the limits. You know, non-tariff barriers you showed us are very important for the effects, but what can we really say on to what extent they are abolished? So now let's open the discussion. We have about 15 minutes for the discussion. Basically, I would like to you to use the hand raised function, you know, that's below the list of participants. There should be something. I have a blue hand now, but sometimes there's a verbal message, raise your hand. So if you have a question, please let us know. I realize there are already some questions in the chat function, and I think Professor Yoshino was the first to raise two questions. Professor Yoshino, would you like to raise them? But please,
yes.
we should try to be short.
Yes.
I think you have two questions to both speakers.
Yes. The first question is how Europe prefer Japan-China relations. Would Europe to go Europe-China, Europe-Japan in separately, or what would be the best coordination between Japan and Europe? So that is my first question. Second question is how COVID-19 will change your gravity model and how will it affect your conclusions? Thank you very much.
Yes, maybe Julie, you go first.
I'm really enjoying these questions. Thank you. They're challenging, and I can't do them justice in a quick response. But thank you, Professor Yoshino. I think just quick reflection on a European approach. And again, I think one of the things that certainly when I was writing my book over the last couple of 3 or 4 years, just the sheer changes in what we mean by Europe, not just the UK departure, but also the internal challenges that the European Union has faced. When we think about what does Europe want, I think we also have to preface that with who is Europe and how are we identifying its clear policy projects at the moment. But with that in mind, I think one of the things that the EPA, and interesting, the EPA as well as the SPA, that the normative commitment is not something that is simply an aside. It's written into the fabric of the Economic Partnership Agreement as well. And it seems to me, at least, if we think about through the Belt and Road Initiative, that I've just found this in my notes that I was going to mention, that about 75% of the energy generation capacity of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, which is the cornerstone of China's development projects, is coal-based. It's a non-sustainable approach. And what Prime Minister Abe did was to say, we need to adhere to the principles of better investment, which directly challenged that approach. And of course, what happens with that kind of generation of energy is it prevents investment in alternative models. So it's not only perpetuating non-sustainable models, but it's also putting a barrier in the way of new models of energy production being created. And Prime Minister Abe was very clear that the project with Europe allowed them to open a different approach to the fundamentals. Having said that, at the same time, Japanese businesses and government reacted to the loss of transport projects because of China's investment by shortening and simplifying procedures and reforming the Japanese Bank of Investment, JBIC, regulations to allow for riskier infrastructural development. So Japan needs to decide to hold fast to that normative commitment. For the European Union, it seems to me that normative commitment is written into the fabric of what that European Union is as a trading partner. So the separate model prevails there, approaching China and approaching Japan separately. But nevertheless, in terms of your COVID question, one of the reasons that I've been so fascinated to watch Japan's progress through COVID when we're in the UK with so many challenges is that if you chart pandemics in Asia, it's a very different picture. We're all shocked here in the UK, but China's shock came in 2004 with SARS, right? The big learning project was then. So it seems to me that on major global issues, we need that global cooperation. So I think, and it comes to a later question, that multilateralism has to be a mixed approach now. And the European Union is going to need that mixed approach.
Okay, thank you. Professor WRONA?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I would like to answer this question relatively quick in 2 parts, okay? So what's going to change in the model? 2 things happening. So we see that these countries that have now the shock, they suffer reduction in their production and also expenditure is going down. So that's basically size components in the gravity equation. And then what we also see is that there's going to be effect on the bilateral transportation cost. We have lockdowns, we have travel restrictions, we have higher transportation costs in general. That will also reduce trade, and typically what we see is trade response stronger to shocks, economic shocks in general than GDP. Okay, and that's also what we observe, and it's going to observe now. What you can imagine as a benchmark, suppose COVID would strike all the countries around the world in exactly the same way. Then what the model predict is basically just a scaling effect. Okay, so everything is then down by 10–20% depending on the size of the shock. But that's not reality. So we know we have asymmetric shocks. Some countries are hurt stronger and more severe. They have longer lockdowns and more of these effects. And then depending on the relative size of the shocks, what you see is going to be some readjustment in the system. Countries which are hit more strongly, they're going to see a larger drop in GDP and trade. Countries who are less strongly affected, they're going to see less strong effect. So I think this is what's going to happen in the model. So the model has the channels that really matter for analyzing the global consequences of that shock. I think that's not necessary to come up with a new model or to build in specific new channels, depending on the question, of course, you want to answer. But if it's really about just the economic consequences of that, how lockdowns affect, for example, trade and production, that can be analyzed, and that has been analyzed already in this framework.
Thank you very much. I realized that I should say, I mean, we are sending these recordings online, but we will also record them. So and hopefully show them in some kind of channel later on. So please just consider that. I think Maaike Okano is next, but Dr. Okano, with your permission, I would like to include some maybe who are not on the panel, because we have not so much time for questions. And with your permission, I would like to ask Dr. Simkevicius first. I think you have two questions. Maybe you can narrow it down to one question to Julie Gilson. Would you like to speak and ask a short question?
Thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Dear Dr. Julie Gilson, I passionately follow your work, and I'm excited to read your published book. Last year, I believe it was published. So I follow your work, which nicely complements my own PhD research conclusions. And my first, and probably this is the only question I'll have, is, did your conclusions about the EU-Japan security cooperation change since you published your notable book on EU-Japan partnership in 2000, which is 20 years ago? Do you still hold that the path dependency, which you so nicely talked about today, will not empower the new SPA with a significant cooperation between the partners? Is tabula rasa more, this Latin term for sort of clean slate, more appropriate restart in the relationship? Thank you so much.
Please.
Thank you. I can't do justice to that answer, and I would really like to engage you in a much longer conversation, so maybe we can do that outside of this forum as well. I think, so I like your idea of the tabula rasa. I don't think it's possible. And I think my point about path dependency is that you can't get away from that historical experience and the modus operandi that both sides have had within that international context. So I think the security parameters and the security context have changed radically. And in a way, I think that the direct challenge for global, for new kinds of global security issues, such as the COVID and especially climate change, mean that we have to utilize what we've got in a different way. So I think that the world is very different 20 years on, which is why I found it timely to write it. And yet, the way that Japan and the EU negotiate and work with each other is remarkably similar. But yes, I think it's a question that we really need to spend much more time on to do it justice, but thank you.
Thank you. So in between, I saw a blue hand from Professor Langhammer, but it is gone in the meantime. So I'm not sure whether I overlooked something.
No, I would like to have a question, okay. One on Julie and one on Jens. To Julie, the coverage, as you say, is of course very broad for the SPA. And it's not quite clear to me whether these shared democratic values are also shared by all 27 members of the EU. Werner mentioned that, of course, the SPA requires full ratification as a mixed agreement from the national member states of the EU. So do you foresee any sort of problems in ratification, given that, for instance, countries like Hungary or Poland would have a different view on so-called shared democratic values, and of course it would mean giving a higher weight and more competence, of course, to the EU Commission. The question to Jens, the model, of course, is based on given trade structures. It can happen that, of course, in the future, trade will shift sectorally from goods trade to services trade. You mentioned some shifts already in the coming with respect to horizontal FDI substituting for direct exports. That's, of course, one shift which we can envisage for the future. But it could also happen that, given that the two partners are aging economies, the trade shifts from goods trade to services trade. Can you run any simulation if the given trade structure of the past will shift more according to assumptions about a higher weight of services trade?
Julie, do you want to answer first?
Just a quick thank you. I really appreciate the question. And I think it goes back to my point that the internal turmoil of the EU can't be underestimated in understanding it as a collective approach to these issues. However, I do think that the SPA, in its breadth and in its recommendation or in its requirement for countries to be committed to cooperation rather than to be committed to tangible action, gives those member states room for negotiation, even if and when they ratify. So I'd be surprised if they don't, but whether that translates into tangible, meaningful action on trickier areas of activity, that's where I would have a big question mark, because I think you're absolutely right that the popular nationalism and the issues around, particularly around countries like Hungary, mean that some of those areas will be unpalatable in their current form. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Two quick answers on that. So in the model that I've shown you, services are included, but as non-tradable. So it's part of the economy. It's not that they are not in the model. It's just that they're not included as tradables. And if I understand your comment correctly, what you have in mind is that following trade costs for services, and then you see a larger shift towards services in the economy overall, and also more trade in services. Absolutely. So I think the challenge here is that, but that's feasible, of course, is that you quantify, and that you in particular quantify the reduction in trade cost for these services. There the truth is that data is much less well than we have data on international trade. There has been quite some progress made. So we have data on service trade as well, but it's less well understood what are the trade costs that matter here. And what you would and could do ultimately is estimate the effect of non-tariff barriers as we do it right now as a residual, which is always a bit difficult because you don't know what else is going into this residual. So there could be other things that you capture by this measure, which not necessarily are really linked to the trade cost reducing effect of the free trade agreement, but maybe some general trends that are going on at the sectoral level. So in principle, it's feasible. Better data is needed, and we need a better understanding of what are the important drivers of trade costs for services, I think. And then this can be included for sure.
Well, thank you very much. Actually, Professor Rolf Langhammer will be with us next week as well as a speaker, so we are already looking forward. Well, Dr. Okano, with your permission, I would actually rather now would like to move on to the second set of speakers. And perhaps, if I may suggest, your questions to Julia also in the chat. So maybe if Julie finds a little time, maybe she can give a short answer to both, maybe send them to all. That having been said, I would now like to welcome and introduce Professor Yoshino Naoyuki. He is Professor Emeritus of Keio University, and he's the Chief Advisor of the Japan Financial Services Agency's Financial Research Center. Until March 2020, he was the Dean of the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. He got a PhD from Johns Hopkins University and has held numerous academic positions and over 3 continents, and his professional career includes membership in many prestigious and important Japanese government committees, for instance, the Ministries of Finances, Council of Foreign Exchange. So he has also published extensively and received the Fukuzawa Award in 2013 for his contribution on to research on economic policy. So there would be such a lot to be said about you. Very warm welcome, and the next 20 minutes are yours.
Thank you very much for your nice introduction. I hope my PowerPoints be shared with everybody. I would like to make it as slideshow. Thank you very much. And I would like to look at connectivity between Europe and Japan and Europe and Asia as a financial connectivity, which I'm going to talk. And quality infrastructure, I define it is not only physical quality, but how infrastructure can develop the region, how it mitigate income disparities, and so on. So I'm defining quality infrastructure, not only physical quality, but also much broader aspects. And I'm going to talk about how to increase those quality in infrastructure investment. And Professor PASCHA asked me to touch upon my paper in this year from MIT Press. And I just wrote a paper about connectivity between Europe and Asia and focusing on infrastructure investment. So this paper, which just I published, is very closely connected with today's conference. So this table shows the huge needs of infrastructure investment in Asian region. And infrastructure is regarded as a basis of economic growth in many regions. And this is the one example in Indonesia, in Bali Island. There's a highway between the airport and tourist regions. And as I said, infrastructure is needed. However, COVID-19 is affecting a lot in many Asian countries, especially fiscal deficits are growing. And infrastructure investment used to be financed by public government finance, and multilateral institutions. However, COVID-19 changes this fiscal situation significantly in Asian region and also in multilateral institutions. So this is the debt to GDP ratio in 2018, just before the COVID-19 started. You can see many Asian countries faced with huge budget deficits compared to GDP. And this has been widened significantly in Asia. So that means if we want to keep infrastructure investment going on, we have to bring private sector finance into infrastructure investment. Otherwise, we cannot keep on constructing highways, digital infrastructure, because lack of budgets by many Asian countries. Furthermore, multilateral institutions, they have to spend lots of money to health, medical care, and so on. So their share of infrastructure would be significantly reduced in next several years. This includes a Japanese budget situation. You can see the last 2020. Our budget expenditure was about 100 trillion yen at the initial budget, but now it has been 60% increase of spending, and tax revenue is expected to decline. So not only Japan, but also many Asian countries are facing with same situation. Then how to finance infrastructure investment? As I said in the bottom, public sector and multilateral institutions such as World Bank, ADB, used to be the major supply of money. However, this money, green line, is shrinking. So we have to bring private sector finance, especially insurance and pension funds are long-term investors. Then in Asia, savings and investment are now balancing very well. In 1997, Asia was hit by big Asian financial crisis. In those days, savings in Asia was very small and the investment needed was very large. So Asia has been lack of savings. But however, after the economic development in Asia, our savings rate can support investment. So S is equal to almost I in almost many Asian countries. However, structure of savings are very skewed in Asia. Most of the savings goes to bank, and it is dominated by bank. And many Asian regions are lack of insurance and pension funds. Those are the major sources of finance to infrastructure investment, because insurance provide long-term supply of finance to infrastructure investment. Pension funds also. Infrastructure requires 10, 20, 30 years of long-term duration. So bank deposits, bank loans are not enough in Asia. So that is where Europe can help Asian development. As you can see here, this is the Asian structure of financial market. As you can see here, top line, insurance companies are dominating and long-term investors are plenty. So insurance can be supplied from Europe to Asian nations. Secondly, pension funds. This is another sources. However, as you can see on the right, pension funds are looking for higher rate of return. And if you look at the left-hand side pie chart, they are not investing into infrastructure because rate of returns are low compared to the expected rate of return. So what we have to do is how to increase the rate of return from infrastructure investment. So I'm going to talk about my proposal to increase the rate of return so that European pension funds and insurance companies can come into Asian infrastructure investment. First, I would like to look at the quality infrastructure. Good infrastructure, this is a red line, is railway, road, water supply, or digital infrastructure that can develop the region, this yellow region, and bring new businesses into the region. The road can provide new businesses. Then new residential area can be developed. And agricultural farmers can use these roads to connect with cities. Then they can sell their products by using these infrastructure investment. So quality infrastructure, I define how much it can develop the region along infrastructure, water supply, digital infrastructure, and how it can mitigate income disparities, providing finance to small and medium-sized businesses. And this long-term infrastructure should be financed by long-term investors, such as insurance and pension funds. And Europe has plenty of money to providing long-term investment. However, rate of return from infrastructure in Asia used to be very low. That's why they could not invest into infrastructure in Asia. So I'm now focusing on how to increase the rate of return. As I explained, in Asian region, population densities are very large. So good infrastructure can develop the region. That can increase spillover tax revenues, property tax revenue, income tax revenue, corporate tax revenues. In the past, infrastructure investors only relied on user charges in this green line. User charges are very low. If it were water supply, people prefer low tariffs, low price. But investors prefer high rate of return. So it is contradictory between investors and users if we only rely on user charges. But spillover tax revenues can be created significantly in many Asian regions. So if 50% of these spillover tax revenues were returned to infrastructure investors, then the rate of return for investors is not green one. It is a blue dotted line. That will increase significantly rate of return. Then insurance and pension funds from all over the world, especially from Europe, pension fund insurance can invest into Asian infrastructure because rate of return become significantly high compared to green user charges and blue dotted line. In the past, all these red portion of spillover tax revenue went to the government of each country without being returned to infrastructure investors and infrastructure operators. That was the reason why many insurance pension funds could not invest into infrastructure. So my proposal, this is a floating bond. First, from T0 to T3, rate of return is very small, the only user charges, but gradually spillover effects becoming effective into the region. Then the rate of return becomes very high. Then part of this rate of return should be returned to infrastructure investors. That can increase the rate of return. So I would like to give 3 examples how much this infrastructure can create spillover effects. So this is a Japanese estimates of indirect effect compared to direct effect. If you can see the bottom ratio, about 68% of infrastructure investment creates spillover. So 32% are direct effect, but 67% are bringing new businesses into the region, and then employment will be created. Those impact is much bigger than direct effect. Then next, I would like to look at the Philippines highway, how much it had increased spillover tax revenues. Then at T+4 is after 4 years of operation. Then T-2 is before construction. Then you can see the significant increase of spillover tax revenues by this highway. Next example is Uzbekistan's railway. This has increased more than 2% of GDP into the region. And last example is Japanese high-speed rail. Left-hand side is the total tax revenue. You can see yellow line, it has been almost twice as much as before. Personal income tax, corporate income tax, and property income tax, all of them increased significantly after the operation. So this shows the spillover tax revenue in Asian region is significantly high. And one more point about difficulties in infrastructure investment in Asia, the risks are associated with land acquisition. In Asia, people prefer to own the land. Agricultural farmers do not want to sell the land. So Japan faced with the same problem about 30 years ago when Narita Airport was opened. Government wanted to have high-speed rail between Narita Airport and Tokyo. It should be connected 18 minutes between Narita Airport and downtown Tokyo. But 2 landowners in Japan opposed it. And we could not complete this high-speed rail between Narita Airport and in Japan. So we started after that land trust. Land trust means landowners on the left-hand side can keep the land ownership. And then they lease the land to railway company or infrastructure company. So they can receive annual rent or dividends every year. And in order to make this transaction transparent, trust bank is in between landowner and infrastructure company. And this will smoothen the land acquisition process. And also these land railway company do not need to purchase land. They can just receive the land and lease the land, and that will reduce the cost. And last one is infrastructure. Construction companies are only interested in infrastructure construction. But when I used 44 countries of United Nations data, education together with infrastructure will create much higher economic impact. Especially in my result, secondary school education and university education had significantly positive impact into the regional development. Secondary school will provide basic skills, and university education will provide high-end skills to the workers in the region. So I think these spillover effects are important, but local government has to also provide education, very good education into the region. Lastly, digital infrastructure after COVID-19 will become very important. And then this is the Indian case. Next to me on the right is Mr. Amitabh Khan. He's under Prime Minister Modi. And right-hand side is Mr. Ramachandran. He liked my idea to utilize my idea into India because land acquisition in India is very difficult. Secondly, digital infrastructure in India had only developed in large cities because they relied only on user charges. However, digital infrastructure can develop new businesses and new residential area. So spillover effects could be returned to these digital infrastructures. Then if India can apply my method, then nationwide network of digital infrastructure could be possible. And that's all my presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I think this was a very important and far-sighted presentation. I mean, like Professor Gilson has told us in the beginning, we have a lot of rhetoric, but where are the resources to actually do something? And you showed us a way. I mean, Japan can offer quality infrastructure, and you showed us in terms of how to finance what quality actually means. And I think Europe can also contribute quality, but Europe also has financial resources to do so. So this is really a wonderful idea how to bring the two together. But before we enter the discussion, let me introduce the final speaker, Dr. Maaike OKANO-HEIJMANS. She's a senior research fellow at the Clingendael Institute for International Relations in The Hague. So that's the Netherlands Institute for International Relations. And she is coordinating there the Asia Pacific research. She's coordinating the Asia Pacific Research and Advice Network for the European Commission and the EU External Action Service between 2016 and 2020. So she's also a member of various other organizations, for instance, the Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific, which is a Track 2 organization for the security dialogue in Asia. She got a doctoral degree from Antwerp University in Belgium and 2 masters and 1 master actually from Japan, from Waseda University. So she has done a lot of work, including EU-Asia relations, and we are really looking forward now to your presentation of what can be done in the connectivity partnership that has been concluded recently. Very warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Werner, for giving me this opportunity to speak after this excellent lineup of speakers. I really appreciate how you're combining, bringing together social sciences people and the economists. That's been one of the efforts in my work in the past 10 years at Clingendael, because I think we really need to learn a lot from each other, because the two are coming together in everyday life. So we cannot separate them in webinars or in our thinking. So thanks for that opportunity. I have to warn everybody, I suppose, out there, my perspective is also a think tank perspective. So thank you for highlighting that in your description of my background. Clingendael is, of course, a think tank based in The Hague. We work a lot for the Dutch government, but also for European governments and some Asian governments. So that's a rather different perspective than I think all the previous speakers who are based at universities. At least today, of course, Professor Yoshino has a background also in a development institute of the ADB. I think what I would like to say complements very nicely Julie's presentation, which was more the academic approach to connectivity. And it follows on, I think, also nicely to where Professor Yoshino ended, which was, of course, the importance of the digital field. that's actually also where I would like to take the discussion, and where I hope we can have most of the Q&A at the end of my short introduction. So let me try and share my screen with you. I did prepare a few slides. I hope you can all see them now. This is, of course, a picture from 2019, September, when Prime Minister Abe and the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, concluded, or signed, I should say, this partnership agreement between between Japan and the EU. I happened to be there, so I could take some pictures, even more from up front. And I have to say, it was a really fascinating occasion where Prime Minister Abe gave an excellent speech in a very passionate way. That sort of made me very happy that Japan had a prime minister who could actually allude and appeal to a big audience like that, because this was, of course, in Brussels. And at the time of the signing of this connectivity partnership, the atmosphere, I think, was very positive. This was following on to the EPA and the SPA that had been signed before, as you already said, Werner, and that had gone into effect in February. And after that, of course, there was a need, as Julie put it, to add some meat to the bone of this SPA. And I think this was a big step. It was also a highly appreciated step, I think, on the part of the EU, because the EU had come out a year earlier, with its own connectivity partnership. I'll say a few more words about that later. And the EU really wanted to take some concrete steps with important partners, highlighting that it was really taking action in this field. And Japan was then the first country with which the EU signed an agreement. As you may know, the EU is currently negotiating more similar agreements. One with India is on the table. I think the United States actually reached out before Japan did, perhaps. But of course, we all know that never got signed. Perhaps something of that sort will come in the future. And of course, with India also, and with South Korea, there's talks on perhaps having this. But so far, the EU is, and Japan is the only one that the EU has of this kind. At the same time that this agreement was signed, there was also a memorandum of understandings that were agreed between the European Investment Bank and Japan's JICA, which is, of course, the International Cooperation Agency. Again, to try and bring this to a more practical level, because, well, the paper tiger as such will not deliver any results. It cannot do projects. And of course, there had to be actors that have to be incentivized to act on this. And the MOU between the EIB and JICA was supposed to add to that, just as the one between the EIB and JBIC, the Bank for International Construction of Japan, of course, and also EIB and NEXI, the exports and imports promotion. So there was a lot, in a sense, more to the connectivity partnership, but the partnership itself, of course, gained most of the international appeal, because it was, frankly speaking, where the two hotshots came together and signed this document. A bit of history, because of course this did not come out of nothing. I won't delve into the detail that Judy did in terms of path dependency, but I do want to elaborate a little bit on the two connectivity initiatives that Japan and the EU had initiated earlier on. Of course, most of you will be familiar with the partnerships of quality infrastructure that Japan initiated already back in 2015. I think Japan was the first country to really respond to China's Belt and Road Initiative, which of course was initiated in 2013. So 2 years later, Japan started to reach out to countries in the region with suggestions for partnerships for quality infrastructure. And of course, again, as already alluded, this was the quality was a stab at China, if you will. Initially, this was done bilaterally. Later on, it was sort of, well, all put together nicely, wrapped together under the EPQI, the Extended Partnerships for Quality Infrastructure, to make this more of a regional initiative, and to add perhaps also coherence, because obviously some of these projects, they cross borders, and well, you cannot just have the bilateral ties in this sense. So this, the picture that I shared with you here, I think it's a little bit of an old one, but I really like how the Japanese government always prepares these kinds of pictures to try and illustrate what it is doing. And of course, we have to ask ourselves the question: to what extent is all of this new? I had some discussions with people at the Foreign Ministry, and of course they will tell you that, well, not all of them are new. It's also a relabeling, a repackaging of some of the projects that had already been initiated before, but to present them as a more coherent whole, and to appeal to the fact that Japan is also reaching out to its neighbors. It's not just the BRI that's out there, if you will. I think this was a very important initiative. Well, then fast forward 3 years, 2018. That's basically when the EU came up with its response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So that took 5 years since the BRI was initially constructed. Now, if you speak to people in Brussels, nobody will say that it was just the BRI that initiated that led to this. But of course, without the BRI, I don't think we would have seen this. So they clearly are related. The sad thing to me is, though, that many people in Europe that are very much aware and know, you know, in quite specific detail about the BRI, China's Belt and Road Initiative, they are not aware of the EU Connectivity Initiative. And I think that's, well, that's one of the pitfalls of the EU, and that not always links well to the member states. EU initiatives, they tend to sometimes stay in Brussels. Not always do member states feel that they've been consulted properly or significantly enough that they will also spread the word, if you will, in their own capitals, in their own countries. So for many reasons, including that, the EU connectivity strategy remains sort of hidden. And I think up until today, basically in every meeting that I do, where I do get to see everybody, I ask participants, how many of you do know BRI? And then most people raise their hands. And then I ask, how many of you do know EU connectivity strategy? And hardly anybody raises their hands. And I think that's one of the issues well, that the EU has to deal with. And the EU then is now trying to take steps to add more meat to the bone to really implement this strategy. I think that's really where we are still at today, 2 years after this connectivity strategy was adopted. This is connecting to some of the things that Professor Yoshino was just also talking about. It is calling for, well, it's making normative proposals also. At the very bottom of this, you see the EU is calling for sustainable, comprehensive, and rules-based connectivity. And sustainable should not just be linked to the environment. Sustainable is really meant as financially sustainable, as commercially sustainable. So don't build roads where they're not needed. All these elements, I think, come together in this strategy. The strategy has various dimensions. Of course, transport has been talked about most. The physical infrastructure is what most people are still looking at. But I think that we have all, well, the COVID crisis has highlighted that digital connectivity is really where we should be looking at towards the future. So it's looking at the content and the challenges of the connectivity partnerships. It was interesting to see that a year after the EU's, and this is going back to the EU-Japan Connectivity Partnership. It's interesting to see that a year after the EU-Japan connectivity and the EU-only connectivity strategy was adopted, where digital was just one little paragraph in this document of about 20 pages, the thematic focus in this EU-Japan agreement was very much digital. Its regional focus was on the Western Balkans, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, Indo-Pacific, and Africa. Now, why do I emphasize this? Because this is important. It's the first document, actually, where the EU uses the term Indo-Pacific. So this was the first step of the EU in engaging with the Indo-Pacific as a region. For different reasons, of course, the EU had sticked to Asia-Pacific, which is the old term. But Japan had really asked for the EU to accept or for the inclusion of Indo-Pacific. And fast forward 1 year again, where we are today, and we see that finally discussions in the EU on how to engage with the Indo-Pacific in more detail are now finally happening. So this is also, I think, one of the outcomes of the EU-Japan Connectivity Partnership, that the EU is now actively engaging with the Indo-Pacific as such. My personal call has then always been for the EU to also take responsibility and create something that we might label the free and open Indo-Pacific of, Europe's neighborhood. I call it the open and connected ring around Europe. Call it whatever you want. I think in Europe, we need to take responsibility also to act in our own neighborhood. Because of course, the reasons for Japan to act in the Indo-Pacific, there are similar reasons for the EU to take the lead in forging such projects and connectivity in our own region. And a ring around Europe is, of course, stretches from Central Asia, Middle East to Northern Africa. And of course, it's in the EU's own interest to engage with these countries further. And I think we stand a great chance of also, getting Japan's cooperation if we do so. So that's one suggestion that I'd like to make. Now, of course, there's a challenge with funds. We don't have the deep pockets that China has, or used to have at least until a few years ago. Not as much now as before. On the funds, of course, finally this week, hopefully, we'll see the multilateral framework, financial framework of the EU coming to a conclusion, the talks about that. And I think with that, we will see also funds, the great funds for what is called the NDICI, the Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument. That would definitely be one instrument where connectivity initiatives can be funded from. Of course, also much more has to come from the EU member states. My own country, the Netherlands, is working quite hard on thinking through how to deal with this. I know Germany has been a leading state in also appealing connectivity and acting on this. So what is happening there? How can the EU and the member states engage with Japan on this? And how can we then get to projects and flagship initiatives, including, for example, the one that I suggested under the label of an open and connected ring around Europe? Because there's many things ongoing already, but we need to label that better to get more appeal to what is already happening. And I think we can also learn from one another. China is, of course, geographically much closer to Japan than to the EU. So I think there's a lot we can learn from Japan's strategic thinking on China. And also then act on the defensive strand. 5G debates, I think, have shown that this sort of physical infrastructure, digital connectivity element, the difficulty of that China's inroads into Europe, into the world, frankly, is putting us to. So engage a little bit more and use also this connectivity partnership to forge more debate about that. And then came, of course, COVID-19, which I labeled in an op-ed that I wrote, the first digital pandemic, both in terms of origin, because, of course, the restrictions on the digital dissemination of information led to the spread of this virus in its very early stages, but also in effects, because many governments are turning to digital instruments to fight the virus. And, of course, also beyond the virus, dealing with the virus, the fact that we are now also all meeting on this webinar style rather than in person is also an effect of COVID. So we need to deal with a world where digital connectivity becomes more important. And we also have to reconsider the effects of too much connectivity. Connectivity used to be something that seemed to be approached with an idea of the more the better. And I think also COVID-19 sort of put us a break on that. And of course, it's not without reason that we hear much more about economic security these days. That's all linked to the US-China tech conflict, where also the focus is digital. So I'd like to take the discussion there and share with you some of my suggestions in these final minutes that I have on what the EU and Japan can do on digital connectivity. Because I do believe that this is the next great game. We have to move from this focus on transport to the digital field in connectivity. It's a shared concern, frankly, of the EU and Japan, of many other countries. We see many initiatives, of course, already ongoing in the G20. You know, Japan's data free flow with trust proposal, debates on 5G are happening. But frankly, there's much more to be done. There's also how to regulate big tech. The EU is acting on this in recent months and in the months ahead. And there's so much we need to do together. So also here, as in other fields of connectivity, I think there's 3 elements, subsets of digital connectivity that we can identify. It's telecommunications infra, it's business, and it's regulation. Now on regulation, of course, EU and Japan have been doing quite a bit already. This data free flow with trust and the EU's GDPR, the data protection legislation, has had a ripple effect and inspired many Asian countries also to start thinking through similar regulations. But on the business dimension, we see hardly anything happening. This is, of course, also related to the fact that both the EU and Japan do not have the big tech companies. So we have been sort of recipients of that without realizing all the effects at the early stages. But clearly now, all these effects are coming to us, appearing to us more clearly, and we have to act on them. So 3 suggestions in the one last minute, I believe that I have, one is to act together on platform regulation and on platform fairness, as the EU likes to call it. And there's 2 elements. There's a defensive element here, curbing the power and influence of big tech platforms. And there's an offensive one, because both the EU and Japan are actually quite good at R&D, research and development, at innovation, but we fail to commercialize the innovation that has been reached. So how do we improve on that? And thereby, how do we improve market presence and market share? Because with that also comes, of course, an influence that we will need in, for example, Southeast Asia and in the ring around Europe. If we want to be present there, that's the best way to also steer countries thinking about certain approaches to digital connectivity. As you can see here, the big guys are really not from Europe or from Japan, but they are from America and from China. So that's one area, big tech platform regulation. The second one is on standard setting, on digital norms. Here we see what the human-centered approach that Japan and the EU have both been emphasizing in different ways. But we share here, there's also normative convergence here between the 2. And I think there more can be done to act on this. Happy to elaborate on this in Q&A, but I'm conscious of time. So I will move to my 3rd suggestion, which is on digital official development assistance, as I call it, digital ODA. At support to 3rd countries to help them develop in a way that would be more in line with the human-centered approach. So rather than furthering authoritarianism, surveillance authoritarianism, or the big tech dominance of the United States, help those countries to realize that there might be this 3rd approach. Of course, all 3 have to be looked in as a coherent whole, but help deliver with that inclusive and sustainable growth in other regions also. Several initiatives on this front have been taken, but I think as part of the EU-Japan Connectivity Partnership much more can be done. I'll leave it to that for now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I think this is also very important because after the idea of focusing on finance or doing more on finance, now we got a second proposal. You argued for the digital sphere and made a few presented a few concrete ideas. So that's also a wonderful way to lead the way forward. Thank you very much. So we have time for discussion until 11:30. I think, Maaike, you have to leave sharp, right? So we really have to, should be able to finish by then. And Julie, you also have some pressure. Do you still have time to ask your question, or?
I can ask the first one. I'm really sorry, everyone. I have an unwell daughter who needs picking up from school, so I have to dash in a minute. But may I ask just Professor Okano, actually, no, I'll ask the first one. Sorry, I've got two, haven't I? Professor Yoshino, I think I really enjoyed that presentation, and I think both of you having that focus on tangibles is really, really important and probably the best way to drive the discussion. I've done a lot of work on land acquisition in Southeast Asia, notably around food production, resource allocation, dam building, and there's a lot of local national laws which have reappropriated and reallocated lands in favor of the government and in favor of large corporations and against local landowners. And as you were talking, it occurred to me that what we have here is a perfect opportunity for further land exploitation. And where there are regulations in Japan and the European Union, those regulations do not necessarily exist in the host countries and the target countries for investment and development. To what extent is the Japan-EU agreement likely to exacerbate this problem, and is there anything they can do about it? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think a land problem in Asia is very much significant in many policy-oriented issues. So my proposal is to use trust bank as an intermediator. Then they can keep all those records of the land ownership. And bank is under the regulation of central bank. So that is one of the ways to entangle of those complicated issues, because land is always the origins of corruption. Many politicians use those land as a technique to receive money and so on. So I think EU and Japan can work together how to resolve those complicated issues in Asian region. That could be also another possibility, as you mentioned, we can do together. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. So I would like to remind all, if you want to raise a question, please raise your hand. And I see the hand of Rolf Langhammer. Would you like to ask a question, please?
Yes, thank you very much to this excellent presentation by Professor Yoshino. I have a question with respect to the trade aspects of let's say, bringing private money, foreign money to infrastructure investment into host countries. The problem I see here is that many of these so-called services, like, for instance, water exploration, wastewater management, are treated in the WTO as non-traded, public, non-profit services. So that means that access of foreign investors, such as insurance companies or, let's say, private pension funds, is closed or curtailed or even prohibited. I remember the case of India, where it is almost impossible for foreign investors to invest in these so-called private services. As these services, of course, countries are not entitled or not even obliged and committed to open these services and to liberalize access to these infrastructure investment, because these are services supplied for the public. So do you have any, let's say, recommendation how to solve that problem?
Thank you very much. Infrastructure is always a strategic policy, and then it has to be owned by each government. So I think ownership of infrastructure is the country as it is. But financing of those infrastructure partly comes from long-term investors in other regions. Especially after COVID-19, many government is lacking of their budget to spend money to infrastructure investment. So I think this is one of the chance for change those ideas. But the important thing is ownership of infrastructure is the government. But financing is coming from overseas. And then overseas investors can receive adequate rate of return. And my proposal is tax increase is created by infrastructure investment. So both government and infrastructure investors gain significantly. So it is a positive plus. So I think it is important to tell the government this idea is not losing you. You are benefited. Yeah, thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much. Actually, I would like to ask a question to Dr. OKANO-HEIJMANS. I mean, you have been talking about the connectivity rings around Europe. So that leads me to the question of, looking at the various regions that have been named by the EU-Japan Connectivity Partnership. And to what extent are both partners really able and willing to contribute to all those regions, and what are the interests, right? So, for instance, I think also from a European point of view, Southeast Asia would be a very interesting region. I think it's also mentioned, if I remember correctly, in the partnership initiative, but obviously, Japan is already very active there, and Prime Minister Suga has already gone to Southeast Asia during his early days. So is there really a chance for Europe to the EU to contribute in that very interesting region? And maybe also the other way around, if you would like to comment, maybe I think Japan has shown some interest in Europe, for instance, in the Balkans. No, Prime Minister Abe has been there. There have been some agreements. So how do you see the potential of the partnership in that region? Thank you.
Yes, that's a great question, of course. And it brings us back again to the question of where do we stand today? Europe has been for a long time, I think, the biggest investor in Southeast Asia. That's a point that few people realize. Of course, only recently did China become the greatest trade partner of Southeast Asia. But the EU has been a key partner for many decades already. So what have we done there, and how can we improve on that, I think is, or perhaps, what do you call it? How can we really make the most of all the presence that we have already, is, I think, the key question. In a similar way, I think, but for more strategic reasons, Japan has been present, as you said, in Western Balkan region for several years already. When the first discussions about China's growing presence and influence in the region were starting, Japan was very quick to enter the region. And this is basically underlying my assumption that I just shared, that Japan will be interested to also engage with Europe. It was many years ago that I was in a meeting with all Asian ambassadors in The Hague, and I asked them, what do you think Europe can do for your region? And then actually they said, well, the best thing Europe can do is have its own house in order. So look at your own, at the EU itself, ensure that the EU is and will remain a strong actor. We can never be a third player of the size as the United States and China, but we can, if we work smartly with like-minded countries, and if we invest in, if we are active and present in multilateral institutions, then we can really make big contributions here. So I think in its own region, also in this ring around Europe, as I call it, EU has been, of course, very present. Only recently did this news come up about Serbia where people were asked which country do you think is the biggest foreign player here, and people looked at China, whereas if you look at the numbers, EU countries have been by far the biggest investors and trade partner of the country. So there's a lot to win, I think, also in perception. And I think that's where Japan's Free and Open Indo-Pacific initiative, which really steered people's thinking to this region and focused minds on why it is needed now, that was so important. So I think even just doing that, there's a big win. And then, of course, we have to look at, what projects can we really do? And after we get this financial framework finally done, then hopefully there can be real investments in key areas.
Well, yeah, thank you. Actually, you mentioned China several times, and that connects nicely, I think, to a question that was left by Julie Gilson, and maybe I just read it. To what extent do you, Dr. Okano, find a desire, willingness within Europe and Japan to work with China in addressing particular connectivity issues? If there are any, can you suggest particular areas where greater cooperation is possible? Your point about digital connectivity in the face of COVID-19 suggests greater competition. So what is your view on that?
Yes. Well, greater competition indeed underlies, all that I will say next, because that's a clear trend. And I don't think that is going to really change anytime soon. Because Europe is really awakening now to some of the challenges that Japan has seen much longer already with regard to China. And we are now finally also starting to act on this, partly also, of course, inspired or pushed by the United States. But like Japan, I do believe that the EU and the EU member states do want to continue to engage with China. Like Japan, however, I think we will move towards a more conditional cooperation. And so I wrote a piece last year about engaging with BRI, but not endorsing it. I think that is really summing up well Japan's approach to China. And I think it would also sum up well the new European approach. So conditional engagement is key. And since the EU is only just now waking up to this, I think we have moved slightly from white to black, and we are now white in the sense that all was positive about China. Then all of a sudden there was this awareness of, oh my God, what is coming at us also in terms of challenges, and now we have to discover the gray zones. And I think that's where, I was saying we have to engage on each other's strategic thinking, because there's a lot of mutual learning, I think, to do. So there's a general trend of competition underlying recent trends, but there is a willingness to engage. I see that in the Asia-Europe meeting that Julie mentioned herself. Of course, there has been the Connectivity Pathfinder group in this setting. They've done great work. Unfortunately, they have not been able to continue their work in recent years, but I don't think that was really on the EU or Japan to blame. So ASEM is one where we have shown willingness to engage. The MOUs that European member states signed with China on third country cooperation. I mentioned them in my question to Julie, because I think they are also a sign of willingness to engage. The problem is that, as with Japan's Eastern Economic Corridor in Thailand, which was also a way of engaging, working with, or trying to get companies, Chinese companies and Japanese companies to work together, it's failing. Because frankly speaking, you get to the ground, and then European companies and Japanese companies, they have to adhere to very different standards. So it's been very, very difficult. I would love to hear, perhaps, if Professor Yoshino has an update of where these projects stand in Thailand, or if there's other examples, or whether any of that is happening. Because I've seen real and honest attempts, but I haven't seen any real things, bearing fruit.
Professor Yoshino, would you like to step in?
I think those cooperation is not government by government, but the private sector by private sector, especially in the Thailand. And that sometimes makes some difficulty because they are producing same automobile or same kind of products. So I think if it were infrastructure and other things, it can be coordinated. But if they are conflicting each other, that may be somewhat difficult. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Frank Robaschik. You wrote it in the chat, but would you like to ask it yourself, Mr. Robaschik? Hi.
Yes, I'll try. Thank you. Dear Professor Yoshino, thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. My question is about the commitment of governments to the projects that they do. So if imagine we can really make a contract on the model proposed by you, but the experience from PPP projects in developing countries and partly also in developed countries shows that sometimes governments do not stick to their promises, so that they do not keep the contracts. That, for example, they do not wish to increase the user charges as high as agreed in an agreement or so. So the solution for private projects normally is that you have a kind of an arbitration. Would that also then be a solution, or do you see any other possibilities to bind governments to their promises, which is especially a problem also in developing countries? Thank you.
Okay.
So maybe I simply add that Mr. Robaschik is from Germany Trade and Invest and is the head of the Asia or East Asia division. Please, Professor Yoshino.
Okay. Thank you very much. It's a very important point. If you let just government to return some of the spillover tax revenues, then current government will agree, but we don't know the future governments. So my proposal is always multilateral institutions go together. For example, in big highway project, 3%, 5% of the money should come from World Bank, ADB, or other international organization. So they will become the watchdog. Their share is very small, but they are always watching the contract of the spillover tax return should come for many years. Otherwise, as Robaschik said, it will be sometimes very difficult, especially in local government projects. Local mayors, local governors will often change. Then they will stop those contracts. That was the mistake. So I think I would like to propose always multilateral institutions come together. Small share, but they will become the watchdog so that those contracts will keep on going. So I think that is very important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So thank you very much. I don't really see another hand raised, but maybe we can have a short and very short and final round among the three speakers, including Jens WRONA. I mean, we have several new developments these days. We have the US elections, and we also have an interesting development with respect to Brexit. I think that we did not mention so far. There is the new UK-Japan trade agreement, EPA, and there is also the intention of Britain to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, so the Trans-Pacific Free Trade Area. And this seems to be welcomed by Japan and by a few other of the members. So we have new developments, and I would like to ask for a final evaluation, you know, whether all these agreements we have talked about, the EPA, the SPA, and the connectivity partnership will improve Europe's engagement in the Pacific region through this partnership with Japan, and whether EPA, SPA, and connectivity agreement, or maybe even something approaching to TPP partnership, will be the main venue. So how should the EU proceed? Are there good chances? And maybe, as Maaike, you have to leave us earliest, maybe we start with you and then to Jens, and maybe for the final word, Professor Yoshino.
Thank you so much, Werner. Yes. Since I haven't been speaking about the EPA, I also will refrain from speaking about CPTPP, but I would very much be interested to hear about the digital chapters and cooperation in the digital field that this is also supposed to further. I understand that one of the reasons that India dropped out of RCEP was the digital chapter and the fact that they perceived it, the international negotiations, to go too fast, whereas domestically they had not really sorted things out. And I wonder to what extent that also goes perhaps for some other potential members of that agreement, and what that says in turn about the multilateral, the potential for multilateral agreements. I see very much in my own field the sort of the emergence of network multilateralism. And Indo-Pacific is, I think, a very clear example of that. And this is, of course, behind the question that I had hoped to discuss with Julie. What are the consequences of that? You know, because in a way, we see the world falling apart in blocks if this is going to continue. And if, of course, those networks that do not have articles of agreement, they are much more fluid. That is in some ways, of course, the beauty of it, or the essence of it, trying to steer things forward. But I think it will be a very different multilateralism than the rules-based order that the EU and Japan have been trying to push. So I have to say I'm a bit worried about developments here. At the same time, I don't think that we can really stay out of it because, well, the world is moving forward. So it's just like with trade agreements, the EU initially did not, was sticking to its WTO first, did not want to go into bilateral negotiations with specific countries. And then we realized, well, WTO is not working, so we have to go that different way. I think the same is the case with network multilateralism. But I think we have to keep in mind that the ultimate goal is still to bring all countries together in specific agreements. So the Indo-Pacific, I like much more than the Quad, which is definitely related to it, because the Quad is suggesting exclusivity. It's 4 corners. And of course, those were 4 countries, very specific, and whereas Indo-Pacific is a more open and, at least in theory, more inclusive.
Thank you very much. Yes, Jens Werner.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So I think to some extent the interesting question is if you think about the EPA, where it's coming from, where it's going to. So the EPA and what it includes now, and that is a focus on trade. Many other things are less ambitious, and as they were, for example, planned under TPP or even TTIP, if you think about Europe. So certain things were left out. Bilateral investment treaties, components referring to investment protections. Other things have been left out, in particular in the agriculture sector, and these were lessons learned from TPP, because this failed for 2 reasons. First, people turned out to have very different preferences, particularly in agriculture things. And this really led to a strong opposition in the public, in particular in Europe. And also there were concerns about investment protection regulations, in particular settlement courts, which are outside of national legislations. So these things were left out from the EPA for good reasons, because what people learned before is that it didn't went well with TPP. The question is whether this will change in the future, and I would be rather skeptical. Now, of course, I think everybody understands, and also economic theory argues that there are advantages of having a multilateral approach. But the rise of bilateral or somehow defined groups of countries which go into free trade agreements that we see now for quite some time might just reflect that there is not so much consensus over widespread measures that could bring people together on a common ground. And I think this is a long run development that we see now. And now what we see is even for relatively small groups, like, I don't know, think about the West, if you think about TTIP, it seems difficult to find a common ground with regard to a lot of questions. So I think with regard to trade liberalization, it seems more likely that we're going to see a continuing trend of smaller trade agreements among partners which are more similar. In that regard, the EPA is just another example of that common trend. So whether UK can find its luck in joining trade agreements with a lot of countries from Asia, I would be rather skeptical. I mean, the truth there is that Brexit is a horrible idea from economic point of view. It just doesn't make sense. So if you want to have trade agreement, you should have trade agreement with large trading partners which are close by. For UK, that is the EU. Okay. Now, to compensate for that by joining trade agreements with the Philippines or with other people, with other countries in Asia, of course you can do that. Of course, it will give you more trade, but it won't make up for what you lose through Brexit. Okay. Yeah, so that might be a second best strategy. The problem, of course, is even if the trading partner is large, it's really far away and distance matters. That's what we know. And that is what trade theory and also empirical evidence can tell you. So it will be very difficult to come up for losing the access to the single market by finding other free trade agreements around the world. And I totally understand that now that the UK is in a situation, they try to get this, but it will be very difficult to come up for this.
Okay, I have two short comments. One is the exchange rate mechanism is very important. China is still closing its capital market. So I think a Chinese domestic financial market is already growing. Then capital market should be opened. And then exchange rate should be based on market. I think without doing that, free trade agreement won't go very well because exchange rate is not market oriented. Second one is in trade adjustment, agricultural sector cannot change their products within 1 or 2 years. Then adjustment speed is needed. That is one of the reasons why digital infrastructure in India didn't go well. So we cannot change all of a sudden. So in each sector, we have to allow the adjustment period so that we can go into the goal. So those are two of my comments. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. So this leads us to the end of today's webinar and research workshop. I mean, there is no way I could try to summarize the 4 excellent presentations, but I think we got a good idea about what the EPA can achieve. Of course, these days with COVID-19 and decline of trade, it's difficult to present great numbers, but we see a solid basis for the extension of trade between the EU and Japan. And we see that the kind of lofty concept of the strategic partnership initiative agreement has become much more concrete through the connectivity platform. And we saw and heard about 2 very specific and far-sighted ideas. One to cooperate more on finance issues, and the other in the digital field that can really lead the discussion further. So I would like to thank the 4 presenters for excellent presentation. I would like to thank the participants for staying with us and for raising important questions. And I would also like to thank the support staff here at the Institute of East Asian Studies for making this possible, combining the various continents in this discussion. And this leads us to the end. And yeah, hope to see you again, some of you, maybe many of you next week. Thank you very much and goodbye.